We're coming to a moment with climate where I think, along with Black Lives Matter, people will find it unavoidable not to have to recognize the truth of injustice. It's something where, despite deniers, the world is now beginning to pivot towards saying this is something that everybody has to confront and own. And I think that one of the things we've learned about the climate action is that, like so many other places of discourse, a lot of the leadership has not included women, despite the fact that women, and particularly Indigenous women, First Nations women, have held wisdoms and knowledges at the community level which would really inform the climate debate. So how can that change? Well, I can tell you how it is changing, and that's through young people and young women coming into the movement and making a difference, insisting that their voices will be heard. And since we are trying to change the world for the future, it's up to us to make sure that young activists, and I'm talking 12, 13, 14, as well as the 20s, they're the ones that have to determine the future. So let's make sure they do have a voice. We're going to do this panel with Connected Women Leaders who've helped us organise the 3 climate panels that we've had, and this is climate number 3. And for that, I'm going to hand over to Savannah Miller now, who's Vice President of Sustainability for Better Earth. Savannah, I'm going to make sure that the baton passes to you now to introduce the rest of the panel. But can I just say welcome from where you are? I think 5 hours behind me at the moment. And have a wonderful discussion between you all. I'll be listening in. Over to you, Savannah.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. Thanks everybody for tuning in. My name is Savannah Miller, as Jude suggested. And before jumping in, I wanted to offer a huge thanks to you, Jude, and the entire WOW Global team for creating this space for us and for a global community of women and advocates for women, and to the captioners and BSL interpreters who are making this session accessible. Thank you so much. And so to bring it back to what we're talking about this evening, afternoon, wherever you're coming in from, this past month has been one of reckoning for the United States and around the world, as we witnessed the murders of Black men and women, particularly George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, at the hand of police. And this is a story that's painfully all too familiar for many around the United States and the world. And it is one of the brutal results of a deeply entrenched and broken system that exploits people, places, and resources for the gains of a few and shifts the burdens to many. And that's why this evening we are focusing on exactly this notion, the nexus between racial justice, which must happen, and climate justice, which must happen, and then the hidden forms of racism that perpetuate environmental injustice, and how the next generation can redefine what power looks like to begin the healing and the fixing that we desperately need. And I also say all of this with the deep understanding as a white woman that I truly don't know what that marginalization feels like, and I still have a lot to learn. And that learning continues here. And I am deeply humbled and grateful to be alongside some incredible agents for change who are working on exactly this at the intersection of climate justice. And so I'd love to introduce them to you. And first and foremost, I'm pleasured to have Iara Vicente, who's indigenous to the Brazilian Amazon and proudly represents the 3rd generation of a family deeply involved in the Brazilian social and environmental movement. Iara is the founder of Nossa, Terra, Firme, just one of her many accolades, which is a strategic consulting company that specializes in scaling up transformative initiatives at the Global South. So thank you for being with us, Iara. And Brionté is another one who I'm so excited to have with us. She has dedicated her career to teaching people how to self-organize and building strategic partnerships that protect the environment, advance racial equity, and grow civic engagement. She now serves as the director of the Georgia Conservation Voters, where she works to elect pro-environment candidates and hold elected officials accountable for their actions and their votes. So thank you, Brionté, for joining us as well. And there's one other person who we were so excited to have their voice as part of this conversation, and her name is Takota Iron Eyes, and she's a member of the Standing Rock Sioux tribe. Unfortunately, she's currently having technical difficulties, but we hope that maybe she'll be able to contribute later in our conversation. But I wanted to share a little bit more about her. She has been confronting injustice since she was 9 years old, testifying against a uranium mine in the sacred Black Hills. And now at 16, she continues to demonstrate her commitment to compelling the world to listen to Indigenous nations and their voices, from the No DAPL movement at Standing Rock to the missing and murdered Indigenous women movement across the United States. Her name, Takota, literally means future, and I feel like the future is already brighter with her in it. So wanted to share more about her and hope she'll be able to tune in later on. But with all of that said, I'd love to turn over to you, Brionté, first, and just kind of dive a little bit further into where we're at. And at the Georgia Conservation Voters, things are pretty busy right now. Y'all are literally in session at the moment. And I feel like with GCV, Georgia Conservation Voters, y'all are constantly kind of pulling back this curtain year after year on hidden forms of racism within the structure of our institutions and the minutiae of legislation, the kind of prejudice that just continues to perpetuate environmental injustice. And I was wondering if you could just offer some examples of what that looked like right now.
Yes. So let's get into it. I'll try to keep my hands down. I get real excited about this stuff. So first, I want to start by making some connections between the climate work and environmental work that we do and racial justice. Everywhere I go, I have to make sure that I'm kicking it off with letting people know that we can't solve environment and we can't deal with climate change without also dealing with the underlying racial justice issues that have allowed this problem to spiral out of control. Black and Latino communities in the United States have been on the front lines of environmental pollution for decades. And a good example of how, without involving them, solutions are inadequate is just take any power plant. You know, they usually have a proposal where they're going to get built. The environmental community would come together and say, hey, we don't want this power plant built in this community. And then they would have typically be white folks who had access to power, access to resources, access to elected officials, and they would usually be successful in stopping that plant from being built in their neighborhood. But that plant would then be moved over into a Black or a brown community where they would then have to deal with the consequences of that plant. They don't have the same access to power, the same access to resources, the same access to elected officials. And so it would be harder for them to stop it. The plant still gets built, the carbon pollution still ends up in the air, and now this community is suffering, having to deal with polluted air, polluted water from the activity of that power plant. And so this is just a tale that goes on across the United States. Every day, we're still building power infrastructure. We're still building plants that manufacture things and so on. We could go down the list, and those end up in Black and brown communities over and over again. It is a system, and it has to do with these folks not having the same level of access and influence over the decision makers to stop these things. And so, you know, you keep putting power plants, you know, out of sight, out of mind, then you forget that problem exists until it becomes the major problem that is climate change that we have to solve. And so whether we're talking about power plants, we're talking about hog farms, which is something we just had to fight, big environmental justice issue in North Carolina. They were proposing to change some laws and allow those hog farms to end up here in Georgia. We had to fight that. I could just go down the list of all these different, you know, assaults that on our communities that we have to fight over and over again. And so as climate changes, communities of color will be on the front lines. They will only have more impacts as climate continues to worsen. They'll feel it first, and then everyone else will feel it. And so we have to make sure that they're engaged and they're front and center when we're coming up with solutions. And I want to say that whether we're rising up to stop police violence, to stop people from being murdered in the streets needlessly, or if we're trying to rise up to demand climate action now, the core thing that's wrong with our system right now is a lack of accountability. We have a broken system system of accountability. We've got plenty of laws and values that say that what we have seen, what catalyzed this moment, is not okay, right? We know murder is illegal in this country. We have plenty of environmental regulations that say that you can't put these things in communities where it's going to sicken them and poison their children. There are laws out there that exist. What we have is a legal system that is not upholding those laws, and we have elected officials who aren't willing to do what it takes to fix laws and systems where they're broken. And so I want to be really clear that those laws and those systems, it all comes down to elected officials. Even in the legal system, we have elected officials, congressmen, state senators, representatives, mayors, city council people, all of these people who are supposed to be passing good policy. They're supposed to be listening to their constituents, understanding when there's a threat to their constituents, crafting good policy by involving everyone who's at the table. But instead, what we've had is elected officials sort of get in, pass the buck, point fingers across the aisle, not really be champions for these issues, even if they might campaign on them. And they get in and they basically fulfill a corporate agenda that upholds harm and upholds the extraction that's hurting communities. And that is allowed to happen because people are not as active or involved or have not been. There have always been groups of people organizing to come together to help make sense of all of this legislation as it's moving. It's dense, it's complicated, it's not accessible. So you have groups like mine, Georgia Conservation Voters, other wonderful groups, Black Voters Matter, ACLU, my partners that we work with that try to be there every step of the way and communicate to people when decisions are being made, how people are being cut out and harmed, and what could be done about it instead. And as long as people are organizing and that movement continues to grow, I have faith that we're going to be able to fix this broken system of accountability. As long as people are there, informed and involved, paying attention to this stuff as it's going on, I think we could really get ahead of this issue. And so that's why groups like mine exist. We know it's complicated, we know it's hard, but we want to make sure that people are engaged every step of the way at every level of government. Both parties are accountable or have not been accountable, and they need to be held accountable. So.
Well, thank you for doing what you do every single day. Really appreciate it. And Iara, I'd love to transition over to you to just kind of build upon what Brionté was saying and bring it over to Brazil. And I was wondering if you could offer some of your reactions to that idea around what we were talking about, that this social and economic system that we have is broken and that it's just not designed to be fair right now. And what does that look like for Amazonians within Brazil's current government? And what do you feel like needs to change?
Of course, first and foremost, guys, girls, actually, women. It's such a great pleasure to be here. I needed even to hold myself together a little bit because while Brianna was talking, I couldn't stop smiling. It's so good to get to know virtually other people that are on the front lines. So thanks for the inspiring work, everyone. For Brazilian Amazon, it's always been a periphery and within the periphery, right? So back in the 90s, where the some major spikes within social environmentalist movements started, we were invisible because there were no internet and there was barely phones, and it was so very easy to, step over people's rights, because there are corners in the world that were not accounted for, and there was not interest from the governments to account for those. Since then, visibility issues have changed because we have major champions, international and local, that have been discussing Amazonian issues. We've been successful in terms of making the area known and recognized by the environmentalist community as a priority. But this sense of a lawless region still continues, for all known effects. And with the COVID-19 epidemics, what we see that is we have a very sad picture of what that looks like for the for other aspects that are not considered directly environmental, that are things that depends of a quality of a state structure, such as healthcare, right? So Manaus, which is one of the biggest cities in the Brazilian Amazon, was the first place here in Brazil that started having mass graves for COVID victims. And that was about 3 months ago. It was like the epidemics had barely started, and they were still already building mass graves, because that's how ineffective government services are in our part of the world. And we come across, as women organizing around climate issues, environmental justice issues, we come across a lot of difficulties in terms of naming those challenges, because there are problems in sort of importing concepts such as sustainable development, such as most of the major concepts that are coined on a global level. And the problem is they don't really translate our reality, but we have a problem here in South America specifically, that is the institutionalized low self-esteem of a people, a group of people that were whose existence has been invalidated by um, outsiders over and over. So that becomes on our colonization process, and continues as the Amazon was invaded by people from the southern regions of Brazil, which were the economical elites that kept, acquiring land and promoting deforestation and invalidating people's lifestyles. The indigenous people of Brazil suffer that in the most blatant way, but others due to because basically what came across with deforestation was a lifestyle, a lifestyle that mimics the cowboy lifestyle that we imported, figuratively speaking, from the United States. So there is a tendency of transporting that sort of lack of autonomy, of thought autonomy, of being in the sure of yourself enough to say, okay, this part of the strategy suits us, and there is this other part of the problem that needs to be addressed, even though it's not in the books yet, even though sometimes it's all on oral knowledge, it's all on our everyday experience, and maybe some rap lyrics and maybe some songs, but it's not the fact that it's not being validated by outside sources sometimes prevents us from organizing properly to address those issues. And I said too much already, but I think that's what it looks like. We have this uh, huge problem, and a population that is still suffering from the systematic invalidation of its culture, of its voice, and of its ability to believe that they are able to promote change in their own terms. The movement that I originate from in the Brazilian Amazon, Acre specifically, has been very successful on creating its own terms, but there is more that needs to be done. And I think valuing its voices in that process can be key, to actually be effective on our changes, and and create um, existential empowerment in the process as well.
I couldn't agree more, and I hear what you're saying too around some of the frustrations with Western influences coming in, and as you're saying, almost like invalidate some of the ages old traditions that you'll have, and understanding and respect around the environment. And it looks like Takota, have you been able to join us? Let's see. Well, I'll wait. If I hear for Takota, I will shift over and ask her a question. But to build on what you were saying, Iara, I actually have a question for the both of you, and just around this idea of empowerment. And, as we think about where we go from here, there's just so much chaos in the world. I mean, there's so many different crises that we are navigating at once right now. We could just say in this 1 month alone, let alone this decade. I kind of want to talk about power for a minute, because power, as we're talking about these broken systems, that's where it stems from, and it has a pretty dirty connotation to it. And I think that as we think about ourselves and this next generation that's coming in and taking on leadership roles that should and must take on seats at the table where it really matters, there's also an opportunity to redefine what that power looks like. And so I was wondering if actually both of you could answer that question in your own words around, how do you feel the next generation will redefine power, and what does that power look like to you? And so Brionté, we'll pass it over to you first.
Sure. So I think I love waking up and doing what I do every day because it is about helping people find their power. I think that the best way for me to say what I think power looks like is when the best thing I can, sorry, let me start over. So the best thing I can think of when I think about power is people coming together and identifying a problem in their community and saying, hey, like, this is going on, this is what's happening to me. And to Iara's point, like, they have to then look for validation and sharing their stories with other people. And we don't always share our stories. Like, we know these things are happening to us. A good example is in Albany, Georgia, we've got people who are dealing with exorbitantly high power bills, which is, a layered problem of having old housing stock, having a municipal utility that's sort of rogue and not really being held accountable, and not having very energy efficient homes. And so they're now also dealing with a natural gas compressor that's come into their community. It's also one of the communities that's been hardest hit by coronavirus in in the southeastern United States. Community is about 70% African American. And so this is also layered on the fact that just a couple of cities away, another young man, Ahmad, lost his life walking down the street, just being himself, just being Black in America. And so you've got these communities with these layered issues, right? Like, they've got issues on top of issues, and environment is just this silent killer, like, in the background, exacerbating all of these problems. And so when a community can come together and say, hey, like, I think I might be going crazy, but does it not feel like all of this stuff is happening to all of us, like, all at once? They get together, they have validation, they're able to come strategize on how to get relief for the issues that they're experiencing in the moment. In Albany, we're looking at some, utility bill, power relief options to help people weather the current summer that we're experiencing and the high bills that we're experiencing. I also want to name that Georgia Power, under the watch of the Public Service Commission, has been approved to start shutting people's utilities off, even though we're still in the middle of a crisis. We're in the middle of summertime in Georgia, and in a community that's been really hard hit. And so they're able to come together and say, this is what we're dealing with. This is how we're going to solve this problem in this moment. But we know we need a new mayor. We need new council people. We need to get people elected onto this utility board. Like, we need, they've got going down the list of like what they want to see in their community once they were able to validate their stories. And, GCV, Georgia Conservation Voters, and the groups that I work with get together and help communities sort of go through that thought process. One, yes, you really are experiencing these things. Yes, it is unfair. Yes, it's unjust. These are the players that are making the decisions. What do you think we should do about it? And then helping like folks actually carry out the things that they brainstorm. It's important that we stop yelling at like the president to solve all of the problems, because he's not going to. And let's be frank, our federal government is a little bit of a mess. Our senators, our Congress people, they're all yelling at each other across the aisle and saying, it's your fault. No, it's your fault. And, I think it's really important that people find their power locally. I want to say here in America, there are, several hundred, just thousands of elected officials, right? Like that people have no idea exist. In Georgia, I talked about the Public Service Commission, right? They gave Georgia Power permission to start cutting people's bills off. But they're elected and they're supposed to be defending people, right? That's what they're elected to do. They're supposed to be defending people from corporate greed, but they've failed on that job. So you've got city council people, county commissioners, state senators, state representatives, all of whom have the ability to do things that I think are more likely to happen than anything at the federal level right now. And so we can't be missing these opportunities to take action locally. And so I think that I'm seeing young people start to be more like curious about what's going on in city politics and more curious about what their county commission is. And I've got people being like, hey, I'm about to go vote. Like, who are these people? Like, what's up with this judge seat? Like, tell me what I need to do. And like, we're totally here for it. And so I think people are finding their power by sort of taking their antenna away from the drama that is the federal government right now and starting to find these smaller areas where they can make dramatic change in their life. So stop rambling.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And it starts local, and people often, I think, forget, or maybe just aren't educated around the true power that sits at the local level. And I'm excited to say it looks like Takota, you've been able to join us. Hello. And I want to hi. I'm so happy you're able to join us. And I wanted to pass it over to you. I was actually asking all the panelists around this idea of power and how the next generation is going to be redefining what that looks like. And so I wanted to pass it over to you next. Well, we had the pleasure of your company. What do you think, Takota?
Yes, thanks. I just want to start out by saying hi, everyone. My name is Takota, and I'm super happy to be here with you all today. I'm sorry about the technical difficulties. I'm actually on a trip with my family right now, so we just pulled over and they're out hanging out outside while I do this in the car. But yeah, power. And I think, sort of this new generation of things is just looking, to sort of atone, I think, for the generations of the past and their mistakes. What are the things that we can do better now? Like, I think young people are starting to finally realize the gravity of the situation that we're in, and the fact that it's our futures that are on the line, our futures that are at stake. And so when we're talking about things like racial justice and climate justice, like, for young people, I think the reality of it is that it's all about sustainability. It's all about how can we start to create a world, where no one has to worry about whether or not their future is threatened. And that's, on a very intricate level, but it's also on a humanity level. How do we as humans work together to create that world? But also, how do we make sure that, young people in general, and especially Black and Indigenous young people, how do we keep them safe right now? How do we keep their lives protected right now? Because we already see that, these communities, these marginalized communities, they're at risk every day. And it's not about an imminent crisis looming over us. It's about how are we going to survive a world that is already seems to be fighting so hard against us in a lot of ways. And as far as like power, I think that it's really not a question of who has it anymore. It's a question of how am I being represented by the people that I elect to hold station and hold power. Oh no, the lights. Sorry, guys.
You're all right. We can still hear you. You're all good.
That's great. Yeah, I mean, it's not a question of, who is the sole person that we as a country, as a nation, elect as president, because there shouldn't be one person upholding all of the power. It should be back in the hands of the people, and it shouldn't matter your stature, where you come from, how much money you make. You should be able to have the same amount of representation in your government and in the people who are saying what is wrong and what is right as anybody else. And I think young people are finally getting that message. It's not about who can say they have the most followers. It's not about who says that they have the most money. It's about how can we make sure and ensure the safety of everyone on this planet. It's about compassion, and it's about recognizing our priorities as a human race. Are we going to let our government run us into the ground to prove a point, to prove the point that yes, racism exists, which is why they're in power. Yes, capitalism exists, which is why people in power are staying there. And you know, how can we start to recognize and atone for these sort of violent truths that we've allowed to exist in this world for long enough?
I could not agree more, Takota. And I wanted to pull out in particular something, the many things that you were saying around this idea that it's a climate emergency, but also people are just fighting for their lives. And so that is, again, pulling back to why racial justice means climate justice, because we need to lift these people up and take away that rightful fear that they have in survival so that we can all channel this energy towards these larger truths. But how can you do that when you're just trying to survive? And exactly to what Brionté was saying and what you were saying as well. And so thank you so much for sharing that, Dakota. And Iara, I wanted to kick it over to you as well. What are your thoughts on the topic?
Yeah, you may be muted.
Oh.
Sorry. So I think I align very much so with the other two speakers, the take on them. And I want to commend Georgia Conservation Voters for its work on the ground, as Dakota's nation, because I think that's the work that embodies what the future of actual power will be like. Thinking about the most positive meanings for the word power. I believe the way I envision, the change makers in the future, the people who actually hold the power because they will hold the moral ground to say what kind of future should we strive to live upon. Is the people who work collectively, who are held responsible for their actions, by a group of like-minded people. Our communities that are compliance of the ethical standards that they defend, because as a social movement activist, that's something that I think about, how to promote health and the higher standards that we dream for the entire country within ourselves, so we don't get frustrated. And so, our work actually survives the long term, which is when we mature as individuals, which is, as life seasons go by. So I think power in the long term, high power, capitalist power, will have to have this other power to deal with, which is the power of the people who have the internet as a source for transparency as well. And we, as representatives of the people who have been oppressed for so long, and of people who are not, being part of the division of the power, actually of the exploitation. We're not benefiting, even um, like even the working class of America, for instance. It has some privileges comparison to depending upon the racial profile, comparing to other situations in the world, but we're not the most benefited by this um, current system, and I think that unifies us as the second group. So we need to have that as a responsibility to actually do better and show on our actions, on our internal organization, how can we actually do different and not just defend an ideal, verbally speaking and narratively speaking, but given the power, acting the same, which has been the something that has killed a lot of movements towards change around the world. So I think having the internet as something that holds us accountable is one of our greatest assets moving forward.
And it's crazy how much things like this have transformed, both for good and bad, the way that we are able to connect with each other, the way that we are able to affect change, and create a little bit more transparency around a lot of different terrible things that are happening. And being able to just capture something on your phone really, I think, can just wake the world up in very quick ways. Like I said, it's good and bad, but I think there's been a lot of good that has been thanks to things like the internet, this being one of the best examples of it right now, all of us being able to chat together in this incredible platform. And so in these final minutes that we have together, I was hoping that we could really end on action and how the folks that are tuning in and each other, how we can support each other as partners in solidarity. And so I was curious if we could go around and just talk about if each of you could offer one concrete action that we can all do right now, despite maybe some disabilities that we might have due to the pandemic, actions that we can do to move the needle amidst the pandemic. And so, Takota, I'll start with you. What's a concrete action we can all do right now?
Yeah, I mean, I was just thinking, even in regards to the question about power, I think like a huge thing, and as we were talking about accountability, it really like clicked. It's I mean, one action that everybody can do, no matter where you're from, where you're at, how old you are, is just taking responsibility for the way that you affect the things around you. And living in the systems that we are living in right now, I think it allows for a lot of people of privilege to not take accountability for the way that their lifestyle, and the way that the system that they choose to perpetuate is affecting other people, and is affecting our environment as a whole. I think it's about, recognizing the rights of nature. I think it's about allowing yourself to believe, that what you do matters. I think that it's about recognizing the power that you have as an individual to incite change and create the world that you physically want to live in. It's not an abstract idea about how we're going to change the world. It is a choice that you have to make every second of every day to want better for yourself and for your family and for the environment around you.
I could not agree more. And that's such a great way to think about it, and something that we definitely can all do and must do. Iara, what's a concrete action that comes to mind to you?
I think is recognizing what is the asset that you hold, and allocating that properly. So if you are in a position of power, if you have the say so in divesting of the major harmful forces of development that pushes the world back to a place of non-sustainability, do so. If you don't recognize what contributions you can have, you can make to a certain cause, action on them, make them available, reach out, connect, and start moving, because I believe that our strength is we are many. So if everyone allocates their own strengths, we have a powerful driving force to count on.
Absolutely. And Brionté?
I want to add to all the wonderful things that have already been said that it's really just about engagement. Like, go out and get plugged in and get involved in your community, whether, it just doesn't matter what the issue is, whatever you feel the strongest about, whatever your jam may be. If it's criminal justice, like, learn about that, go out, connect with the group that knows that stuff in and out. Like, everyone needs help. We are fighting climate. We're trying to advance environmental justice in Georgia. Like, we need hands on deck. I've got people at Black Voters Matter, New Georgia Project. They're out trying to engage a whole new audience, a whole new electorate, get them registered to vote, help them navigate the confusing system that is the United States. And I will name that it is confusing. And so, it's complex, but there are groups out there doing work to make sure that the things that you care most about are clear and you know where to take action there. So the key ingredient is people jumping in and getting involved, and don't be nervous about what you don't know, because there's a whole crowd of people here to help you wayfind. Okay, just get involved. We will plug you in and we will make this happen. Okay. Yeah. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, what I'm gathering from this is like literally we're all in this together. And I think that's something that our generation knows better than anybody, is this idea of creative collaboration, because we can't do this alone. And the stakes are way too high. And we know that more than anybody else. And I just can't thank you guys enough for joining me in this conversation. Amidst this pandemic, it can feel a little isolating being on your own, and conversations like this and platforms like what WOW has offered are incredibly inspiring and motivating, and something that kind of that kick in the butt sometimes, at least I need. And I'm just so thankful to have had this conversation with y'all. And, to everybody that's listening, I think that one key thing that we can all just take away from this is that we literally cannot see a decarbonized world until we address and dismantle the systemic racism that's holding so many of us back. It's hidden, it can be sneaky, but we've all learned a lot more this evening on how to spot it and how to stop it within our communities. And we all have a key role to play.